the crocodile breeding management program, biosphere reserves, conservation reserves. Can someone tell me what do you think is a fundamental difference between the other in situ areas versus, oh, Prachi has already given the answer, yeah. The fundamental difference between the sacred groves on one hand, vis-a-vis the national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, the one fundamental difference is it is managed by the local community. Good, that's the right answer, Prachi. Any other thing that you feel is fundamentally different between a sacred grove and all the schemes that we have discussed as part of in situ conservation? Other than the fact that it is managed by local community, any other difference that you can think of? Very good. Not established by law. So if you look at protected areas, biosphere reserves, national park, wildlife sanctuary, all of them have the power of law, the force of law behind it. Sacred grove is more cultural, more historical. So I want you to remember two things. Yeah, will you be able to remember? The first point I want you to remember is that because this is also in situ, there were three in situ, no? Habitat protection, species oriented, and sacred grove. But sacred grove is different from the other two. Why? First, it is local, that is managed by the local people. And the second, it does not have the force of law. Force of law. There is an exception to it. I'm coming to it. It is mentioned in the same slide. But for now, you remember it like this: local people and the force of law. So that's on the sacred grove. Now, what are the things that are usually done and usually not done? Yeah. So generally, the forest dwelling communities they indulge in using the forest for their day-to-day needs. For example, honey collection, deadwood collection, small timber.
அப்பதான் இங்க புரட்சியும் வரும் என்று ஒரு காந்திசத்தை போல அது அழிந்த பின்னால் தான் அங்க புரட்சி.
Yeah, I think you can keep it on mute. Someone would have mistakenly. Yeah, thank you guys. So where were we? Yeah, so what is allowed and what is not allowed? So what is allowed is this: as long as you don't hurt the forest or its biodiversity, that is allowed. 1 second. Yeah, that is allowed. What is not allowed is hunting is strictly not allowed. Cutting of trees for the purpose of timber roots, that is strictly not allowed. So these are things that are not allowed. Now, here comes an important point. Till 2002, there was no force of law for sacred groves. As Prachi rightly said, that the other ones were established by law. But in the Wildlife Protection Act, when it got amended in 2002, they added a category called as community reserves, which we discussed in the last or the previous class. Now, sacred groves, legally speaking, logically speaking, technically speaking, can be included under community reserve. Therefore, the context for you to understand is normally sacred groves have been outside the purview of law. They do not have the legal force of protection. But the Wildlife Protection Act of 2002 enabled the concept of community reserves and sacred groves, because sacred groves is what? It is protected by the community. Okay, so this is one thing I want you to remember. What are all the uses of the forest? I think this we all know. We have discussed last time also. Why is biodiversity necessary? Preventing desertification, recharging aquifers, genetic diversity, soil erosion, etc. Okay. Now, can someone tell me, let's say, the approximate number of sacred groves in India? Like 50, 100, approximate. So as always, I want an order of magnitude, somewhere between this to this. There is no official number, by the way. You can get it from Wikipedia, and from every state you go, you can get it. You get a rough idea. I want you to just understand around 80. Okay. Any other number? Okay. So first thing is it less than 100 or more than 100? How many of you for more than 100? Prachi is more than 10K. Okay. So clearly she is one who thinks it is more than 100. Anyone who feels less than 1000? More than 1000? Okay. So The unofficial means when I say unofficial, the estimated value. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not 1 lakh. It's between 5K to 10K. This is the amount of sacred groves that is estimated to be all over India, which means it's a fairly big number, huge number. In that, some sacred groves are very small, some sacred groves are very large. And sacred groves, the largest sacred grove in India is in Himachal Pradesh, in a place called Haryali Devi in Chamoli district. That's the largest sacred grove in India. Yeah, I think somewhat it merges with the wildlife sanctuary, etc. But the largest sacred grove is in not Himachal. I'm sorry, I stand corrected. Uttarakhand, Chamoli Devi district in Uttarakhand. That's the largest one. One of the most important sacred groves in the northeastern part of India is called the Mawphlang, the East Khasi Hills. You must have heard of these hills in Meghalaya, no? Garo, Khasi, and Jaintia. Yeah, this is how it goes, no? From west to east in the state of Meghalaya. Yeah, so it is East Khasi, so east of Khasi, so between Khasi and Jaintia Hills. So this is one such beautiful place, and there are a lot of other. This is a very high level representation. So there can be multiple. For example, Kerala alone has something like 2,000 sacred groves. Kerala alone, imagine. Yeah. So that's how it is. In Karnataka, you have two places, Kathalekan and Kodagu. Kodagu is also known as Coorg in English. In Kerala, you have a special type of sacred groves with snakes as the theme, and hence the name Sarpakau. It's along the coast of Kerala. Okay, so these are some of the sacred groves in India which were in news, not now, but 1 or 2 years back. But I thought still the concept is relevant. So that's on the sacred groves. Yeah, one thing I forgot to tell you. So there is one sacred grove which is completely water based. This is in Sikkim. So we saw that there it can be forest, it can be lake, it can be mountain, it can be hill, and all of that. So the Ketchiopalri Lake in Sikkim, apparently it's a very good tourist location also. Generally, too many tourists are not really welcome near the sacred groves because we leave behind the trail that we have come to that place. You know, it happens. Other than food wrappers and so many other things are left behind. Some people try to engrave, their lovers, if it is what we call it, the Amar. Yeah, and in the process, you hurt the trees. All those things happen. So as a practice, tourism does not really go very well with sacred groves. Okay. Since we are talking of sacred groves, and we are also talking about community initiatives, one interesting thing that you should know, even though it is not technically a current affairs, but it did. I tried to connect the current affairs forcefully with the concept here. So the current affairs news item was Sikkim is home to 27% of India's flowering plants. Okay, 27% of India's flowering plant is present in Sikkim, and Sikkim's area itself is 0.2% of the geographical area of the country. Okay, so that's on the Sikkim. Now, why does Sikkim have so much of biodiversity of, especially when it comes to flora? Okay, so one reason what they have figured out is the altitude of Sikkim varies from 300 to almost up to Kanchenjunga, yeah, 8,598 meters. So at various altitudes, you have various what kind of diversity here? Can someone tell me at various altitudes what kind of diversity of the three diversities? Means the topmost level of diversity here would be the ecosystem diversity. Why? Why do I say this? Because you will have all the important things: subalpine vegetation, temperate vegetation, tropical vegetation. You have various kinds of vegetation. Now, when you have three kinds of ecosystem diversity, now each of that ecosystem diversity will have its own species, and hence the reason for high species diversity in case of Sikkim. So one aspect is geographical, definitely. Second, and the more important aspect is the people's orientation towards nature. People's orientation towards nature. So people's orientation towards nature is what? In general, the people of Sikkim and the state government of Sikkim are known for their environmental friendly practices and policies. Environmental friendly practices and policies. So much so that Sikkim has got an international recognition. Okay. Now the international recognition is it became world's first 100% organic state in 2019, and it received a very prestigious award from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which is called as the Future Policy Gold Award. Even if you can remember this 100% organic state, it kept coming for a long time. I'm sure some of you who have been preparing the last 1 or 2 years, you would have heard of this. And so this is about the government of Sikkim, the state government of Sikkim taking efforts. Now then comes another rule which came 2 years before that, which was called the Sikkim Forest Trees Amity and Reverence Rule 2017. What it says is you can associate yourself with a tree. It's such a novel concept. You can associate and you can create what is called as a fraternal relation. Fraternal means what? Brother, sister. Yeah, fraternal, fraternity, we say, no? Fraternal means brother, sister kind of relation. So you can adopt a tree as a family member, as a brother or as a sister. And you can, as a citizen, I'm saying, as a citizen of the state of Sikkim, you can adopt a tree or trees through what is called as a myth, MITH. So that is the name that they have given to the relationship of a person adopting a tree. So as you can see, the reason why I am saying this is, if at all in any exam, if something comes on organic state, organic agriculture, environmental friendly policies, fraternity between human beings and the forest, your answer must contain Sikkim as an example. Yeah, if not in mains, at least in essay, you should try to bring Sikkim and the organic policy and the myth relationship that they have created with trees, all that into your answer. It will make your answer that much richer and different from the others. Okay, good. Since we've just completed the in situ conservation, before going on to the ex situ, ideally I should have covered it even before conservation, but it's okay. This topic on coral and coral reefs. Yeah, this is an area which is important both for the preparation as well as for the mankind. And we'll discuss the various aspects of coral. What are they? How are they formed? What are the coral reef conservation strategies? What are the threats to coral reefs? Some of the international initiatives and some of the current affairs. Yeah, so this is a topic in itself. Okay, so now whenever someone says coral and coral reef, we tend to have a picture like this, right? This is what we all see in coral. Different colors, looks very colorful. People do snorkeling. You understand snorkeling, scuba diving, snorkeling. That people put on those gears and they go into the water. It's a great tourism sport in many parts of India. I know for sure they do it in Andaman Nicobar. Maybe they do it elsewhere also. Some of my friends had gone there. That's why I know that. One of the things that they really look forward to is corals. Yeah, and see them firsthand. It's such a beautiful sight. I have never done snorkeling, but whoever has done it have said they really enjoyed the experience. So, what are these corals? Every time we see coral, you Google coral and you put an image. This is the image it comes. Now, the first question is whether the coral, whether it is a plant, whether it is an animal, whether it is something else. We don't. But every time we look at coral, we see a colorful thing. But what is that thing? THING. What is that thing called coral? So let's try to dissect it part by part. So what are corals? First doubt, let's clear whether it is plant or animals. The answer is very clear. They are animals. The coral. Yeah, the coral part is animal. Marine invertebrates means they don't have a bone, backbone, so to say. Yeah, invertebrates. And they are sessile animals. What does sessile mean? Sessile means they cannot move. Very interesting, no? Animals, but they cannot move. Animals, but they cannot move. As in, there may be a slight, what should I say, exception. We will see the exception, but this is the general thing. They are sessile animals, which means they are immobile. Why do we call them immobile? Because they are connected to each other and to the ocean floor through calcium carbonate. So they are attached. So a lot of things here. The first question was whether they are plant or animal. They are indeed animals. So it's clear because the moment you say invertebrate means animal. Now then we are saying they are also immobile. So immobile animal, which means food is going to be a serious problem. So if an animal is immobile, how is it going to eat? Let's see that. Before that, what is coral made up of? So the basic building block of coral is called as polyp. So I have polyp 1 plus polyp 2 plus polyp 3 up to polyp n. That makes a coral. Simple. That makes a coral. Now, this polyp secretes and it results in what is called as an exoskeleton. Even if you don't remember exoskeleton, it's okay. That exoskeleton is made up of calcium carbonate. That calcium carbonate acts as the hard cover for the coral. So far, so good. So this takes care. Okay, what am I looking at? I'm looking at an animal. Now, whether that animal is dead or alive, we will see in a minute. Okay, so far so good. So polyp multiplied n times makes coral. The secretion of polyp causes an exoskeleton made up of calcium carbonate, which results in the hard cover. Okay. Now let's look at a couple of more points. Okay. Now we said it is immobile. Not exactly as it happens. They have a system of darts. DARTs. Darts means arrow. Yeah, whenever small animals called as zooplankton come near them, they have a system of darts through which they can kill, and they can also have a very limited, small distance movement through which they can eat those zooplankton also. But overall, whenever you see the definition of corals, it is generally mentioned as a sessile animal. So one is this dart and eating it, but the other important source of energy for coral is the symbiotic relationship it has with the microscopic algae called as zooxanthellae. And it is these microscopic algae which gives corals their colors. Okay, so there is a symbiotic relationship. So symbiotic relationship, on one hand, you have the polyp slash coral. On the other hand, you have the zooxanthellae. So what does this guy give him? So the zooxanthellae feeds on the metabolic waste of the polyp, and the polyp in turn gains from the output of photosynthesis of this microscopic algae. So whatever oxygen and sugar is produced by the microscopic algae is used by the coral. So there is a symbiotic relationship. Now it's very clear. Coral is an animal. It is live. And once it dies, the live colony builds on them. So it's a combination of life and death. It is immobile. It has two mechanisms. One is through dart, and the other primarily is through the symbiotic relationship. Okay. Now, this slide has a lot of facts. Generally, I would not recommend people to remember facts, but all these facts are interesting, and I want you to remember it. Okay. Coral reefs are the largest structure of biological origin on Earth. So statements like this, if you write in your mains answer or essay, your answer stands apart. Largest structure of biological origin. Also considered as a tropical rainforest of the sea. Why do we say tropical rainforest of the sea? Because in the tropical terrestrial tropical rainforest, you find that within a limited area, you have enormous variety of species. Similarly, they occupy 0.1% of the ocean surface, but they have 25% of the marine species. And not so. This is from a biodiversity point of view. Is it helpful for human beings? According to UNEP, it is helpful for 1 billion people, primarily along the coast. Now, 1 billion people in what way? Now we are seeing this word called ecosystem services. Do you recollect? Importance of biodiversity, there were 3 parts. The first part was ecosystem services. So what are the ecosystem services it provides? Coastal protection. So coastal protection is what? Coastal protection against Yeah, that's correct. Largest living structure on Earth, the Great Barrier Reef on the eastern coast of Australia. You're right, Vishnu. So coastal protection is what? The corals are generally found on the coast. Therefore, they act as protection against the wave action. Yeah, sometimes uh, on the tidal action also. So it prevents the erosion of the coast. So this is one. Fisheries production. Now, fisheries production is important. You know why? Wherever the corals are there, it is found that the small fishes are found near the corals. The reason is apparently the small fishes spend some time at the shallow coral area before it goes deep sea when it becomes a little bigger. Source of medicine, recreational benefits, and tourism avenues. So these are quite logical. I don't have to explain this to them. Yeah. Tsunami and hurricanes also very true. Tsunami and hurricane also. So they act as a barrier against high tides, barrier against cyclone, tsunami. In fact, since we are talking of tsunamis, corals as well as mangroves. Please remember, both of them act as barriers which can reduce the impact of tsunamis. Okay, good. Yeah, so this is a report by IPCC. So when I kind of made the slide and reviewed, I saw that each point was referring to a different dimension about coral and coral reef. So to the extent possible, try to remember it. Yeah, at least the first 2 points is highly, what should I say, maybe botany. So we have botany experts in the group. They may be able to add more points. But from a civil service point of view, the point 4, 5 and below becomes very important. Okay. Sometimes they have asked very technical questions, be it microbiology or genetics. So, you shouldn't be thrown off guard if they ask some what appears to be a simple botany question, but which we are not able to answer. Okay. So good. So this is the high level basics about corals. Okay. Now, when we say reef, so reef is the solid structure. Now it is made up of calcium carbonate, one layer over the other calcium carbonate. So it becomes hard. Yeah, it becomes hard. So that is called as the reef. But the reef itself is of more than one type. Apparently, there are 3 types of reefs: fringing reefs, barrier reef, and atolls. So Bishanjit Singh just said that the Great Barrier Reef. So he was referring to one kind of reefs called as the barrier. Then there are the other kind called as fringing, the third kind called atolls. Let's very quickly see what they are and how do we remember them. Fringing reef, the funda is very simple here. Forming borders along the shoreline, as simple as that. Fringing reef means you think of these reefs present very close to the coastline, very close to the coastline. That's your fringing reefs in simple language. And I've looked at some examples: Indonesia, Philippines, and Caribbean. They have fringing reefs. Barrier reefs, they are also at the coastline, but a little far away, few tens of kilometers away, where the water is still somewhat shallow. It can be, because the sloping of the continental shelf. Remember continental shelf? The slope is not the same. In some places, the slope is very, very gradual. The coral reefs are formed much away from the actual coastline. So, example is Great Barrier Reef, New Caledonia. So, all these things I want you to take up an atlas and see where is New Caledonia. We'll do it in the class. Will take up some time, though I would like to. But I'm presuming that whenever you see an area which you don't know, it is better that you see. By the way, this is anyway not very far from the Great Barrier Reef. It's on the Pacific coast to the east of Australia, the place where you have Fiji and other places. So that's on the fringing reef and barrier reef. The third one is the atoll. So atoll is an interesting kind of a thing. So atoll, no, you imagine it like this. So there is this water. There was this island. Okay, so this is island. So this island is of volcanic in origin. This island is volcanic in origin. So now for this island, there is a fringing reef here and all through the border. So this is your fringing reef. Now, because of plate tectonics, this island has sunk down. Possible? Just as the island has come up, the island can also sink down. The island has sunk, but what has happened to the coral reef? The reef remains. Now, because it was a volcanic mountain, and if you look from the top, let's say it is circular, the top view of the volcanic mountain. So the fringing reef was like this. Now, what has happened? It has submerged under the sea. But will the coral reef get affected by plate tectonics? No. because coral reef has a different origin. No? The origin of coral reef is different. So that is why when you have a reef where you find that this is water body and there is a coral reef, you can very confidently say that once upon a time there was an island. Okay. In fact, several classes before, I think I saw a reef. I don't know if it's still there. 1 second. Marine pollution. Ah, yes. Are you able to see this? Nawatu Reef. So there is no island, you see. There is water on this side. There is also water on this side. So what is the only possible explanation? There was a land there. Yeah, some point in time before there was a land there. You'll find several reefs like this. Some of the most beautiful islands, all the islands where the entire Bollywood goes on vacation, or by Bollywood, when the normal people here, India also go on vacation, like Maldives, like Lakshadweep, for example. These are all examples of atolls, ATOLLS. Okay, so what this essentially means is now these are islands, but eventually the geological forces were to happen, sooner or later they will be submerged, not because of climate change, but because of the plate tectonics. Lots of slides, man. I'm really thinking, how are you guys really going to remember all of this? I don't think I'll be able to remember all of this. Okay. Oh yeah, I've given a lot of examples here. So once again, I request you to take up the atlas and please look at all of them. Yeah. So I've tried to at least give you some clue as to which one of them is in Pacific, which one of them is in, or this is Indian Ocean, which I have not mentioned. So the first three, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, they are all in Pacific. Chagos Archipelago, the right in the middle of Indian Ocean, south of India. Lakshadweep, Maldives, and the outer islands of Seychelles. All of these are examples of atolls. Yeah. So maybe you could also ask, if you are very much interested, you should ask your parents to send you to these places and say that this is purely for study purposes. It will be interesting to see their response. Okay. Geographical distribution of corals. So one thing that we should remember, this image I thought says it all. How are the corals geographically distributed? So I take this 30° north and I take this 30° south. Yeah, I draw a line. Oh, sorry, the line is not straight. Something like this. Yeah, 30° north and 30°. Oh. So you see that 95% of 95% of your coral reefs are in the tropical zone. Are in the tropical zone. They are in the tropical zone. And as you can see, one ocean which clearly seems to have a lot of coral reef is Pacific. Yeah, followed by Indian Ocean. The way I look at it is, Atlantic seems to have relatively less coral reefs. As it appears from the map, it seems to have relatively less coral reef. So if you look at it, you have coral reef starting from here, at least starting from here. Then you have Lakshadweep Island. Then you have Maldives all the way here. Then you have Sri Lanka, coral reefs over here. In and around Andaman and Nicobar Islands, you have coral reefs. You have some Chagos Islands, Seychelles, all of it comes here. Then you have some heavy coral reefs around Philippines and the South China Sea. A lot of coral reefs. Yeah, this thick one is your Great Barrier Reef, eastern part of Australia, and your entire Oceania. Too many things for me to really say which one is. So all your Caledonia, Fiji, Tuvalu, Kiribati, all of it comes here. So as you can see, even if you look at Pacific, the western part of Pacific, yeah, if I were to divide Pacific like this, the western part of Pacific seems to have a lot of coral reefs, and the Indian Ocean also has a lot of coral reefs. So you have this Gulf of Aden, you have the Red Sea, you have the eastern coast of Africa, and this place is your Caribbean. Caribbean, once again, not the full part, maybe somewhere here. This is your Caribbean, and the coral reefs start from Florida itself. Florida state of US starts, and then some coral reefs on the eastern part. So you have some coral reefs here. In fact, this is that the island where Darwin did his. I forgot the island name. See, it happens. Don't remember. Someone help me with the island name. What was the island name? Where he found this laws of natural selection, or Galapagos. Thank you, yeah, Galapagos Island. And so pretty much it's clear. That's the spatial distribution of coral reefs. Latitude wise, it's very clear that they are between 30 degrees north to 30 degrees south. And longitudinal wise, you can see that a lot of it is on the eastern hemisphere, so to say. Yeah, you're right. A lot of it is on the eastern hemisphere, primarily in the western Pacific Ocean. Okay. Now, one thing I want to say, because sometimes UPSC questions are based on exceptions rather than the general rule. So, if it says that corals are never found in deep water, the answer is wrong. They are also deep water corals in the colder region, but that's more of an exception. Whenever you have an extreme statement, I think you know that this is some of the basic techniques. Whenever you have an extreme statement, generally you have to be a little bit cautious. Sometimes the extreme statement could be true also. But when it comes to coral reefs, majority of them are in this latitude in shallow water. Why in shallow water? Because only if it is in shallow water can the zooxanthellae can survive. And once it survives, it does photosynthesis. It makes sugar, which can be used by the coral, and therefore the symbiotic relationship. But it so happens that there are certain corals which do not have symbiotic relationship. I did not want to go into so much detail because it was an exception. But I thought you should know as an aspirant that there are some coral reefs which are there in the deep water. Okay. So that is on the coral reef. What are all the things that impact them? All of that is mentioned here. One second. Someone has forgotten to mute their mic. Please mute it. I'm just trying to find how to mute myself. All of you. 1 second. Yeah, here it is. It was there. I don't know where did I miss it. But anyway, no problem. The sound is not there. Thank you, guys. Okay. Importance of coral reefs. I think this you can read by yourself. Yeah, there is not much we talked about. Wave action, tropical storms, tsunami, all of that we talked. Shelter for marine organisms. 25% of the marine species is there in 0.1%. A source for nitrogen. They help in nutrient recycling and all. Yeah, I think this is something we don't want to discuss. Yeah, one thing that we should discuss is what is this coral bleaching. I saw this nice picture, the US government's oceanography website. I thought, this kind of really makes it very simple. When the temperature of the water increases, one of the reasons, when the temperature of water increases, the coral reefs, that is the polyps, which is a living being, they are sensitive to temperature fluctuations. That's point number one. Point number two, we also know that when the temperature increases, the dissolved oxygen is reduced. Do you agree? Long back we studied. When the temperature increases, the dissolved oxygen comes down. Both of this put together stresses the polyps and the corals, and the first instant reaction is to eject the zooxanthellae. So what do they do when they are under temperature stress? What do? They eject the zooxanthellae. Yeah. So this is one part. So the moment the zooxanthellae is ejected, who gave the color to the coral? It was the zooxanthellae. The moment it is ejected, the color of the coral is also lost. But then the color alone is not lost, because we just studied at the start of coral reefs is that both of them have a symbiotic relationship. So if one is taken out of the equation, the other's survival is at risk. Okay, so which may result in faster death of the polyps population. So one is the coral themselves eject the zooxanthellae. The second part is, if the water temperature increases, it has been found that the zooxanthellae concentration itself comes down. Okay, so either case, what is happening is that the zooxanthellae gets dissociated from its host polyps, and the symbiotic relationship is broken. The moment symbiotic relationship is broken, we all understand that neither of them can survive for a longer duration. At the very basic, this is what leaching essentially means at the microscopic level. Okay. So this is given in three stages, which I thought is easy for you to understand. And at the right, the reddish one, you see the reasons: changes in temperature, temperature of the ocean, runoff and pollution, overexposure to sunlight. By the way, this is also very important. Now, while I have touched upon the ocean temperature, overexposure to sunlight, if sunlight becomes more intense, that also results in the bleaching of the corals, which are at a very shallow water, which means the sunlight really penetrates them and hits them hard. Okay, so that's the overexposure to sunlight. Extremely low tides. When the tide goes extremely lower, what is happening? The coral, which is at a higher depth, it almost faces this condition. It comes up a little bit because the tide has gone low, which means the coral, which was at a much deeper position, now is at a lesser deeper position. The moment it is at a lesser deeper position, the exposure to sunlight is increased. Okay, so these are some of the reasons. Yeah, so this was the current affairs I was talking about. There is this world body called as a Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, and they have released a status report of coral reefs across the world. There isn't really much for us to discuss in it, but it helps to know what are all the highlights of the report. So as per the highlights, the world has lost 14% of the coral reefs. As per this report, there have been slight conflicts also, but if we are talking about this report, we'll talk about what the report says. 14% of the coral reefs have been lost, and threats, coral bleach events, loss of hardcover, all of that is related to it. And what is coral restoration? Yeah, while the report talks about the loss, obviously we need to look at how can you conserve the corals or restore the coral. So there are 3-4 methods that are used universally across the world. The methods are direct plantation, a specialized method called coral gardening, third method called larval propagation, and fourth is artificial structures. Artificial structures is planted coral. So if you look at it, it is something like an outside intervention on the corals. Yeah. So direct transplantation, coral gardening, larval propagation, and use of artificial structures. So these are ways in which people have traditionally used the coral, traditionally helped in coral restoration. So that brings us to the end of coral and coral reefs, where we looked at in some detail about what corals are, what is the symbiotic relationship, what are their causes for the coral reef destruction, what are the consequences, what are the importance of coral reefs, so on and so forth, and one report on the global coral network. Let's now move on to the second aspect of conservation, which is ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation. So ex situ means we know that the conservation is not done in the natural habitat. The species, the threatened species, is taken out of its natural habitat and protected in a controlled environment, so that there it can be given a more specialized care, which may not be possible in the plant or the animal species in its natural environment. So we will look at just 3 major types of ex situ conservation. The first one is the botanical garden or zoos. All the major cities have zoos in one form or the other. In Chennai, we have a really big zoo, and it's so big that you require a cycle. They give you cycle, and you have to cycle around the zoo. It's so big, just on the outskirts of Chennai. Botanical garden. What zoos is for animal, botanical garden is for plant species. Yeah, various. So it could be herbs, shrubs, creepers, or trees. So that part of botanical garden, or those types of botanical garden which are exclusively for trees, they are called as arboretum. And in India, the concept of botanical garden is fairly well known. In Ooty, I have gone to Ooty Botanical Garden, so I remember it. But that's not the only botanical garden that you have. You have in several places. I have just mentioned some of them. Yeah, in Kolkata, Bangalore, Lucknow, Noida. These are some of the examples of botanical garden. Zoos we have in so many places in India. The next type of ex situ conservation is gene banks. Gene banks. So clearly, this is for what? Genetic resources collection and preservation. Collection and preservation. So that is what is gene bank. So what are they? Whether they are used for plants, whether they are used for animals. Let's quickly look at it. So in case of plants, so let's first look at. So in vitro means in vitro storage. What it means is outside its natural environment. So whenever you come across the word in vitro, you would have heard of in vitro fertilization also, the concept of test tube babies. So, but the term in vitro refers to outside its biological place. Yeah, that is called in vitro. So there you do for in this case for plants, it is cuttings of the plant, yeah, or stalking of the seeds. So when the seeds are being separately saved, stored, those are called as seed banks. And in case of animals, what is seed for the animal? The equivalent for animal is the sperm and the egg cells. So these are kept in gene banks under frozen conditions. So that's one part of the bank where we looked at both the plants, the storing of plants, genetic resources, either in the form of the cuttings or in the form of seeds, and storing of animal genetic information either through sperms or eggs. Now, when you talk of gene bank, one term that they use is called as accession. Accession. So when you come across the term, don't get confused. It is just means a sample. It is roughly equivalent to sample. But what they do is, when I say one accession of a particular rice variety, what they do is they collect the samples for the same species from multiple places. So that is how the gene bank concept works. Even if it is of the same species, you collect it from different locations and different populations. So that's a process that they follow. So accession is referred to that. Accession is a sample, but not one sample, several samples. Why several? Because it is collected from different locations and different populations. Okay, so that's on the gene bank. Do we have a gene bank for the world? Yes, we do. And in this, it is specifically for seeds. Yeah, the one that we have for the world is for the seeds, and it's called as the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Yeah, I want you to also Google this place and find out. It's in a place called Spitsbergen Island. Spitsbergen. So you can imagine it is the northern part. So this island is to the north of the northernmost part of Norway. You can imagine this is almost close to the poles. Spitsbergen Island. That's where you have the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. So what does it do? It houses the collection. First thing that would come to your mind is, why do we need to store all the seed varieties of the world in one location? It is to have a backup in case of a global catastrophe. Global catastrophe. What if some species are lost due to natural disaster? What if someone pops a nuclear explosion on an area which is having very high diversity? What if it rains for 21 days completely? Okay, and that's why it is also called as the Noah's Ark for seeds. Yeah, you must have heard of the story, Bible, Noah's Ark. So it rained continuously, and each species of animal was put in this boat, and they saved. That's what it says. So because of various reasons, it's called by various names: Doomsday Vault, Apocalypse Seed Bank, or the Noah's Ark for seeds. So it is the last resort for human beings. Even if the existing vegetation is destroyed, we still have collection of all the major food and the non-food crops. So the biodiversity is conserved artificially. And let me tell you, this is a level 2 protection. What I mean by that? Level 1 is each country has more than one seed bank itself. For example, India has its own seed vault. US has several seed vaults. For example, if you look at this statement, there are 1750 seed banks in the world. But in terms of number of countries, we have 200 plus countries, but 1750 seed banks, which means on an average, each country has 5-6 seed banks of its own. Yeah, but as a secondary level of protection, each country has also given some species. For example, India has given more than 60,000 seed samples to be placed there. Yeah, what if in India's seed bank it is in Ladakh? What if some crazy Chinese incursion happens and something happens to the seed vault there? So there is a secondary level of protection at Norway. Now, why Norway? There are a lot of beautiful things about Norway. Traditionally, Norway has never really been aggressive, or European powers typically have ruled the world. Norway is one example. Norway does not fall under that category. So one, if you look at it, it is politically very stable country, geologically very stable country. So they have found out that the impact of plate tectonics or chances of a tsunami or a cyclone or anything of that happening is very, very less. So it is politically very stable, internationally very neutral. You'll be surprised to know that in the Sri Lankan Tamils versus the Sri Lankan government, it was Norway which had intervened for some time. Yeah, there was a Norwegian representative who was trying to broker a peace deal between LTT and the Sri Lankan government, which eventually fell through. But you can't imagine you go all the way up to the North Pole to find a representative for a issue which affects a country which is close to the equator. Anyway, so that's about Norway. So they have a peaceful political environment. They have been traditionally pacifist. That's the meaning of the term pacifist. So it's very unlikely someone is going to drop a bomb on Norway. But it is possible that someone can drop a bomb even in US or Russia or China or India or some of the major countries, because they are all politically very important countries. And it is also helpful that it is near the North Pole, because just like we had mentioned in the previous slide, you need low temperatures. Yeah. So artificially you have to refrigerate. Suppose you have a seed vault, let's say in Brazil, for example. Brazil does not have the kind of mountains that you have in Norway. So the temperature of Brazil is always 20 degrees, 25 degrees, 30 degrees, let's say on an average. Now imagine that you're able to have a power supply, refrigeration, and 24/7 there is power supply. But what if there is a sabotage? What is the power fails? What if there is a major grid tripping? What will happen? Then the temperature will rise and all your seed sample will go for a toss. So because of all these reasons, the northernmost part of Norway, which is Spitsbergen Island, in which Svalbard seed vault is present, has been chosen as the location for the global seed vault. This is how it looks. Sometimes pictures will help you to remember it better. And the Indian seed vault looks actually quite simple in that way. So at Changla, which is in the Ladakh region, we have 5,000 seed accessions. We just discussed what accession is. And the seed vault is a joint venture between DRDO and ICAR, Indian Council for Agricultural Research. So one specialized division of ICAR called as the National Bureau of Plant Genetic Resource, and one specialized subdivision of DRDO called as Defense Institute of High Altitude Research. They have collaborated together to create conditions for storing 5,000 seed accessions. As you can see, what is common? The first thing that strikes me, what is common between both of them is this. Yeah, snow. So that's very clear that is one of the criteria for a place to be chosen as the seed vault. Okay. So we have discussed zoos and botanical gardens. We have discussed gene bank. The third one is cryopreservation. Cryopreservation. Cryo. 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 Have you heard of cryo in a different context elsewhere? In a different context? Anything else? Cryo something? Excellent. Cryogenic engines, exactly. Cryogenic engine, which is used in this launch vehicles. So that's cryogenic engine. So those engines are designed to work in extremely low temperature. How much low temperature? Almost at the point which is called as the liquid nitrogen point, which is minus 196 degrees Celsius. So really unthinkable. So at this low temperature, what happens is all biological activities is known to be suspended. Yeah, if you go deep, they do say that there are a lot of precautions. Sometimes it can cause irreparable damage also to take it to such a low temperature. But in that, under some specialized condition, taking out the moisture and keeping them, in some specialized condition, it is possible to have all biological activities suspended, which means whatever state you have taken the tissue, technically, theoretically, you can keep that tissue in that condition almost indefinitely. Okay? So technically, it is possible, and these are some of the things which can be cryopreserved, which are cryopreserved. But this would require highly specialized container called as cryo containers, in which they drop the specimen and they keep it locked. Okay. So that completes a lot of things about biodiversity. This is perhaps our third class on biodiversity. And what we have left pending is A, biodiversity legislation in India, B, biodiversity legislations and conventions globally, and C, some more current affairs related to biodiversity. So all of that can get completed in today's and the next class. By the way, Saturday will be our usual international relations class. There won't be any change. And I just also wanted to ask from you, would Sunday be okay? Anyone has a problem if I take a class on Sunday to compensate for Wednesday's class? You can just let me know. Sunday, how are you guys placed? I was thinking we can just finish it off on Sunday so that it doesn't become crowded towards the end. Let me know if anyone has a challenge. You can message me also separately. But otherwise, I'm thinking of completing the Wednesday class on Sunday. I'll let you know either ways, whether it is happening or not happening. You will get an email from our admin. Okay. So let's look at legislation. There are a lot of them actually. They are important. There are questions asked of them. So it is important we try to go over some of the key points of these legislations. Starting with Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Okay. So Wildlife Protection Act, what are the objectives? Self-explanatory objectives. Prohibition of hunting, easy to understand. Protection and management of wildlife habitats. Yeah. So it's not a coincidence that soon after this, your Project Tiger also started in 1973. Establishment of protected areas. Regulation and control of trade in parts and products derived from wildlife. So regulation and control. Yeah, sometimes you have to be very cautious about the word that is used. Sometimes in examination they say that it prohibits the trade, and generally we are tempted to write yes, it does prohibit, not necessarily, it only regulates. Yeah, so there is a subtle difference between regulation and prohibition, and it also contains a provision about management of trade. So the objective is fairly self-explanatory. I don't think we need to go too much into depth over here. What are all the salient features? What are all the salient features? So it defines animal species in a very broad manner, and protection also in a very broad manner. For example, wildlife protection, when you say, suppose you're trapping a wild animal. Okay, you have technically not killed it, you have trapped it. But by trapping a wild animal, you are still violating the provisions of Wildlife Protection Act. Okay, capturing, you only captured but not killed it, you are still violating the Wildlife Protection Act. Killing and poisoning, anyway, that's so far so good. So this is about animals that you can see. Now imagine you have damaged their eggs. Means they are not yet born, but you have damaged. Yeah, so you've seen some egg and you were hungry and you did an omelette of it and ate it, let's say. Yeah, then you have violated the provision of Wildlife Protection Act. Yeah. So in case of reptiles and birds, even the eggs are included under the Wildlife Protection Act. So that's the first point. It's against taxidermy. In fact, I should say it prohibits taxidermy. A better word would be prohibits. Taxidermy is what I think in one of the class we discussed. No? The villains of the Hindi movie and the Tamil movie, they'll have this head of a deer or a tiger skin or the teeth of a tiger. It's sometimes very crazy. I've seen movies where the villain has the teeth of the tiger put as the what do you call that? Pendant of a chain. Yeah, just to show that he has killed the tiger with his bare hands and he has the tiger's teeth as a pendant of the chain that he is wearing. Okay, so all that Wildlife Protection Act, the moment you do it, you are going to jail. Yeah, so it's better you don't show off your trophies. So that's taxidermy. So this is a term that you should remember. That is why I've highlighted it. It means preservation of dead wild animals as a trophy. Skin, horn, eggs, teeth, nail, everything. Okay, any part of the wild animal, if you're found to be in possession or if you're displaying it somewhere, either in your house or if a photo circulates in social media that you are standing behind a trophy of a wild animal, then you are in trouble. Okay. Now, in order to institutionalize, in order to, one is to make a law. Okay, you make a law. Other is to how do you administer the law. One way of administering the law is to have the necessary organization. Therefore, this act also provides the advisory boards, wardens, and specifies their powers and duties. Because when a law comes, always remember there is also an organization comes. There is a set of office bearers that come. Their powers, functions, duties, do's, don'ts, all of that is mentioned. So same with Wildlife Protection Act also. The Wildlife Protection Act also helped India become a party to CITES, Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. So that is why this regulation of trade and fraud, so this was also included under the Wildlife Protection Act because India later became party to CITES. Now, if someone violates a Wildlife Protection Act, yeah, someone smuggles it, someone kills it, there are a plethora of agencies that can arrest you. One, the police, under whose police station limit comes. Second is even organizations like Central Bureau of Investigation, Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, and Customs. Why Customs is coming here for violation? Because many of the times the wildlife are being hurt for a trade purpose. Yeah, trafficking for trade purpose. So customs, whether in airport or in the ports, shipping ports, they are there. You will invariably see that customs has found a transaction, having some live animals. I'm not able to recollect which animal was. I'm not sure if anyone of you remember it. It was going to Thailand or some of the Southeast Asian countries. 100 live animals they were put in a box, small animal, I think something like a size of a chicken or something of that sort, pigeon or some wild animal, which is going to Thailand, and that a parcel was intercepted. So all these agencies, this guy is the most important one, Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, because they are specifically for this purpose and they have the technical knowledge to understand the nature of the crime and the trafficking, and accordingly they take action. Okay. Now, ever since 1972, it has undergone lots of amendments. In 2006, if you remember, we had this National Tiger Conservation Authority. That and the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau were included by amending the 1972 Act. And in 1991, it was amended to include the Central Zoo Authority. So schedules, so schedules are important. So always, whenever you talk of Wildlife Protection Act, remember that there are 6 schedules. So you can divide them, let's say, Schedule 1, Schedule 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Schedule 1 and 2. Animals which are Schedule 1 and 2, they should not be hunted. Means they have absolute protection, and if you are found to be in possession of an animal protected under Schedule 1 and 2, then you have the highest punishment. Schedule 1. Schedule 3 and 4, it contains those animals which have protection but not of that degree. So you will still get punished, but the punishment will be lesser. So 1 and 2, highest protection. 3 and 4, moderate protection. Schedule 5. Schedule 5, you are welcome to kill those animals. I'm slightly exaggerating, not welcome, but you are completely okay. No one is going to even ask you if you kill those animals. Those animals come under the category of vermin, rodents, for example, rats, fruit bat, and all of them. So Schedule 5, animals that come under Schedule 5, you can hunt them. No one is going to say anything. Schedule 6. So what is important here is Schedule 1 to 5 is for animals. Schedule 6 is for plants. Schedule 6 is for plants. Schedule 6 prohibits cultivation of certain endemic species. Means when I say prohibit cultivation and planting, so again it's not an absolute. It will require, if you want to plant, you need prior approval from the regulatory agencies. To prohibit, you can replace prohibit with this. You need prior approval for cultivation and planting. Why? Because these are endemic species. So now you cultivate it and you have for somehow it goes outside India, then it is we will see in the Biodiversity Act 2002 some of these things are prohibited. Okay, so Schedule 6 is for those plants which are endemic in nature, which should be permitted only, which should be cultivated only with prior permission, which you will never get for some of these plants because they are endemic in nature. So they've given a list of the plants which come under Schedule 6. Those plants that come under this list, they are not to be cultivated. Okay. So we completed the first legislation, which is Wildlife Protection Act, in which we looked at what was the objective, what were the key features of the act, like taxidermy and all that, and eggs also included as part of wildlife protection. Then we looked at the 6 schedules and what they deal with. We also looked at amendments and what kind of organization or bodies got included after the amendment. Now we will mix or we will combine certain current affairs with certain legislation. So we are still under biodiversity legislation, but there was also current affairs related to this. I'm trying to club both of them. Okay. So in 1918, in India, we had an act called as the Forest Conservation Act. So first, the theory. So we are not going directly to the current affairs article. We are going to the theory called what is Forest Conservation Act. The Forest Conservation Act 1980, it deals with 2 things. Deals with de-reservation of forest and use of forest for non-forest purposes. Now, it deals with restriction. Restriction on whom? Restriction on the state government. So what does the 1980 Forest Conservation Act says is, if you remember, there were the certain areas in India called as the reserve forest. Yeah. So now, as you may be aware, forest as an area, environment and forest as an area, it comes under concurrent list. So both the center and the state can make laws. State government can de-reserve the forest unless there is a central government law which prohibits that. That central government law is the Forest Conservation Act 1980. So it says before the state government does de-reservation or uses a forest land for non-forest purpose. So non-forest is anything else, agriculture, industrial purpose, anything other than afforestation is non-forest purpose. Okay. So in those things, the state government has to take prior approval of the central government, prior permission from the central government. In simple term, this is what Forest Conservation Act is. Now, what is the purpose? The purpose obviously is to prevent the state government from indiscriminately using the forest land, for non-forest purposes. Yeah, which means it helps to prevent deforestation. In very simple language, you can say it helps to prevent deforestation. Now, what happened was this definition of the term forest. This came in for discussion in a case, a very landmark case. Normally, till this case, which happened in 1996, forest meant forest. The definition of forest was as per the definition of Indian Forest Act 1927 or local law, all those forests which are under the forest department. So these were the 3 terms that govern what forest is. Okay, forest as defined in the Indian Forest Act, or if there is any local law, or if it is in the control of the forest department. So in 1996, there was this gentleman by this name, Godavarman. So this is a very important case, guys. When it comes to environmental legislation, I want you to remember this. Godavarman Tirumulpath case. So he was actually a very descendant of one of this royal families, and their family had actually, because after independence, um, um, they had to give the land to the, in this case, the government of Kerala. So after giving, and this the forest land that was given to the government of Kerala was the pristine Nilgiri region. Okay. So what this guy saw was, after the land had gone to the state, the extent of deforestation or the pace of deforestation had increased. Somehow, the state government was able to argue that the forest in those patches of Nilgiri did not fit in any of this definition. They were able to argue. Okay, the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court gave a landmark judgment. So this is known as the Godavarman case. The Supreme Court gave a landmark judgment. First, the Supreme Court expanded the meaning of forest. It says, okay, Indian Forest Act is fine, but let us go with the dictionary meaning of forest. So the Supreme Court says we will expand forest to include all thickly wooded areas. That's how a dictionary would define forest. Okay. Now it says that the Forest Conservation Act 1980, which was defining forest as per the Indian Forest Act 1927, will henceforth define forest by the dictionary meaning, irrespective of their ownership, whether it's a private land, whether it's a community land, whether its area is owned by the state government or the central government. We will go with the dictionary meaning of forest. So what it did, in one stroke, it brought to focus the problem of illegal lumbering or illegal logging of forest all across India. Suddenly there were, because now this became, the Supreme Court had said a lot of illegal activities around forest, which were basically hiding because of the definition of forest, they could no longer do that. So this was one very important judgment of the Supreme Court related to forest. Interestingly, this 1996 is also the time when you had this Taj trapezium case. You remember it when we talked about the Taj trapezium case. So at that time, the Supreme Court was very active in environmental related legislation. Okay. So the states were directed to form expert committees. So this is fine. This we have discussed. Yeah, what the Supreme Court did, that because forest, conservation, all of them are technical matters, it asked for the formation of a central empowered committee. So when we touched about Taj trapezium, Indian Railways is double laning a particular road, and that slide, if you see, I would have mentioned this central empowered committee. So the central empowered committee has to say yes, we can go ahead. Okay. So and this central empowered committee concept was given by Supreme Court way back in 2002. Now that one single judgment had repercussions for several years together. Because what happens in Supreme Court, as we always know, you can quote the previous Supreme Court judgment. So whenever an environmentalist was filing a case, he could always quote this Godavarman Tirumulpath case and say, as per this, the Supreme Court had decided. By quoting this case, many important environmental friendly measures were taken. Stoppage of mining in Kudremukh. Have you heard of Kudremukh? Which state is Kudremukh, guys? Any idea? Kudremukh? State of India, Karnataka. Excellent, Karnataka. And what is to be mined there? Which mineral? Major mineral Kudremukh. Any idea? Yes, correct. It's iron ore. Iron ore is there. Now, it also had a similar prohibition of marble mining in Aravalli. So, Aravalli generally is a very neglected area. There was marble mining in Aravalli, which was also stopped, quoting the same judgment. Regulation of sawmills. So, sawmill means the place where the processing of wood happens. Okay. So, the Forest Conservation Act itself, if you see, it is only this much. Yeah. Then it is the Supreme Court judgment which covers the rest of our slides. Now, why is this case important? For the first time, and this is very interesting, for the first time, the Supreme Court also was able to guide or lay guidelines on saying that when we destroy a forest, okay, how do we calculate the amount of compensation? So the first time, the concept of net present value. So what I want you to do is that net present value, by the way, is a term that all businesses use when you have to start a business. In simple words, what is net present value? Net present value means if I start a business and let's say I need to put 1 crore into it. Okay. Now, whether the business will be profitable or not, I take my proposal. I'm slightly moving from the forest because net present value is more of an economic / commercial term, usually used by startups also. Net present value means I have a startup idea, but I think for me to realize the startup idea, I need 1 crore of investment. So, and I go to an investor. I say, hey, I need 1 crore of money because look, the cash flow for the next 10 years is like this. And if what is net present value? Suppose I say, hey, my initial investment is at 1 crore, and for the next 10 years, I will get 10 lakhs every year. So 10 lakhs every year means what? At the end of 10th year, I am breaking even. But that is incorrect. Why? Because 10 lakhs at the 10th year, its current value is going to be less. Yeah. So net present value is a principle used to identify the current value of a future cash flow. A lot of sites which give formula and examples. If you want, you can research. I think it is a useful thing for you to research. So I encourage you to research a little bit more about net present. There's a lot of videos on YouTube. If you ask me, I can also share. So for the first time, why is net present? Okay, so that is the startup idea. But how is net present value important in a forest? Suppose I am a private developer. It is proven that the forest area, after taking the necessary approval, able to remove the forest area. Now, how much should I pay? One component of payment is very simple. I need to do afforestation. This is related to another concept called compensatory afforestation. I'm clubbing this both. I am a private party. I have to destroy a forest because I need to build something. And I imagine I have taken all approvals from center, state, all bodies have taken. Okay. Now the question comes, how much should I pay? The first component of pay is I will have to do afforestation. Suppose I've destroyed 100 acres of forest. For planting 100 acres of plant, I need some money. Yeah, I need to buy the saplings. I need to secure another land of similar area. And then I need to employ people. That amount of cash flow is there. There is a second component of money that I need to pay, which is the net present value, which is nothing but for my new land where I'm just growing the trees, for it to reach the current forest, which I have deforested, it will take 50 years. So in those 50 years, yeah, the forest area that I have destroyed, it could have given me produce, no? It could have given me honey, it could have given me non-timber forest produce, it could have given me timber, it could have given me maybe medicinal crops. All those values I will add up, and there I will tell him, in addition to the amount that you need to pay for afforestation, which is the first component of the compensation, you also need to pay the net present value of this forest which you have destroyed. So this concept was given by Supreme Court in this judgment in 2002, and from there on, this concept has been used in compensatory afforestation, which we will discuss shortly. It also established this compensatory afforestation and CAMPA, Compensatory Afforestation Fund Management and Protection Agency, and it also said that for any commercial activities in protected areas, prior Supreme Court approval is required. So who will go all the way up to Supreme Court? Anyway, they know that they won't have a chance. So this case, Godavarman case, is considered as a watershed movement in environmental legislation. It started in 1996 and there were subsequent judgments all the way up to 2002. Okay. Now, so this is our part A, which is about the Forest Conservation Act, in which we discussed. Then we discussed part B, which was amendment. There were two major amendments, one in 88 and one in 96. Then I talked about the 96 amendment. So we are still in the forest conservation. Now the thing comes, why is the need for amendment again? Why? So far there is no bill for your information. There is no bill, therefore there is no act. What they have done is the Ministry of Environment and Forest in October had released a consultative paper. To do what? To do away approaching the center for permission to use forest land for non-forest purpose. So go back to the act. What does it say? Take prior permission from the central government. This part they want to dilute. Is it clear? So that is the purpose of it. Which means, in a way, trying to turn back the clock and make it easy for the infrastructure projects to be implemented in forest area. So to that extent, it goes somewhat against the spirit of what the Supreme Court had done in the 1996 case. Okay, so this is the crux of it. Now, what is the government's viewpoint? The government's viewpoint is, under certain cases, what are those cases? Under the case of national security projects. So in many cases, you will find that national security is the reason that is given to exempt certain things. Are you able to understand? So similarly, here also they are saying national security projects like what? Like roads, like railway lines. Which means, I'm assuming, because it is not very clear. So tomorrow, if we are laying a road for better connectivity of the border areas of Arunachal Pradesh with China, that the government wants to exempt from the Forest Act. Kind of logical, right? Because you need faster troop movement. But Arunachal Pradesh, once again, somewhat it comes in the Indo-Burma region. Indo-Burma region, as it is biodiversity hotspot. So you can see some conflict between environment and national security. So the government says, in such cases, we are thinking of an exception. So overall, though it has not become a bill, leave alone act, overall the thinking in the government is, we will have a proposal to use forest land for non-forest purpose under certain special conditions like national security projects. But if you have, and you guys would have read Polity better, so you may know it better. Correct me if I'm wrong. The CAG audit, is one area where the CAG does not do a thorough audit, or the agency is not is required to submit a detailed expenditure statements when it comes to intelligence. All the intelligence funds are not really subject to CAG audit, though they are subject to audit from the internal department. They are subject to internal audit, but there are restrictions on CAG audit for some of the intelligence funds, external, specifically in that external intelligence. Okay, great. So that completes the second legislation on forest, which is Forest Conservation Act 1980, which got amended in 88 and 96. 96 was a landmark amendment. Now the government is looking at amending it again. Why? For national security concerns and make it easier to use forest land for non-forest purposes. The third legislation is Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Act 2006. Now in this, if you look at some of the traditional forest dwellers, which include scheduled tribes and other forest dweller communities, they have been living there for generations. That we agree. They have been staying there for generations. Time unknown. They are born in the forest. They live through the forest. They die in the forest, and they have a strong bond with the forest. But is that forest area under their name? Is it registered in their name? For example, in a city, if you had to buy property, you need registration, right? There is a sale deed where the ownership is transferred from party A to party B. In case of forest, can we have a sale deed? No, because the forest area is India's property. It does not belong to any individual. That is point number one. Point number two. That's a fair point, because it's a forest area. You can't really give away forest area to a private person. In the sense, that has also happened, but in this case, traditional forest dwellers, that is one justification that is advanced. The second, okay, you're not giving them forest land as a sale deed, it is not registered in them, but it is also a fact that they have been living for generations. Yeah. What happens if a company wants to set up a project in an area, in a forest area where there are forest dwellers? Okay, let's say a hydroelectric project needs to be made somewhere 50 kilometers, but the submergence caused due to the reservoir that will get formed, it is going to submerge a lot of forest land. Will permission from the traditional forest dwellers be required? Is there a condition where they can be denied this right? Forest Rights Act is an attempt to address the long-standing demand of the forest dwellers, requesting the government that give us some right, maybe not title deed right, we are not absolute owners, but we should not be evicted on the whims and fancies either of the state or of the private party. So in order to reconcile these conflicting requirements, this Forest Rights Act came in 2006. So what does the act say? Let's look at the key features. First thing, vest the forest rights. On whom? On the traditional forest dwellers. Okay. Why do you do it? Because they have been staying in the forest for generations, but their rights is not documented. Same concept. You don't have a sale deed. You don't have a land registered in their name. So what is the intermediate path? Madhyama Pratipada, as Buddha would say. What is the middle path? The middle path is, under this act, it gave the forest dwellers certain rights. Rights to ensure control. Control over what? Control over forest resources. So rights to exert control over forest resource, which includes including right of ownership, but not on land, but to collect, use, and dispose minor forest produce and have certain overall community rights for a village or a set of villages in that forest area. So you are acceding to some of the demands, saying you have right of ownership on some of the forest produce, non-timber forest produce or minor forest produce. You won't be harassed by the government or the forest official because that much ownership you have. Okay, that is point number one. This is the first part of the Forest Rights Act. The second act it says is, suppose tomorrow, if you look at it, why is Naxalism? Why do Naxalism and backwardness of districts, or why are they directly correlated? They are directly correlated because people in those districts or those villages, they have been quote unquote left out of India's growth story. So how do you bring them in mainstream? You will bring them in mainstream by having the social infrastructure, like the school, like an Anganwadi center, like a public health center, like a panchayat office. So the basic essential things that is necessary. Now, if the forest dwellers have right of ownership, how can the government go and build some of these infrastructure projects for the benefit of the forest community? This should be allowed, right? So this is allowed. So what it says is, the forest land can be used for public utility facilities, but with the recommendation of Gram Sabhas. That is how they'll get connected. You need electricity, you need telecommunication. So you are included in the mainstream of India's growth story. Otherwise, you continue to remain out of the growth story, and therefore there's a greater tendency for joining the Naxal movement, either by will or sometimes by force also. Okay, so this is in short, or just the two key points about the Forest Rights Act. Does this actually happen on the ground? The case study in Polavaram project seems to say that it does not happen. You can look at the news article and figure it out for yourself that Polavaram project is considered as one of the world's largest drip irrigation project, and it is expected to get completed by livelihood, not just livelihood, their own presence is, or their villages, their way of life is threatened, because the reservoir that will be created by the Polavaram forest is going to inundate those villages. So while theory is one, in practice, at least in the case of Polavaram, it seems to be the opposite. So this is one criticism. The second criticism has come from the wildlife conservationists, especially the tiger conservationists. They said that if you give forest dwellers the right to ownership, okay, it is possible that their movement to some of the tiger reserve core areas will increase. So they say that tiger conservation and Forest Rights Act cannot go together. So that is the second type of. One criticism is whatever rights they have been guaranteed, that is not protected. Second criticism is too much rights for forest dwellers, not too much right, even the right of ownership of forest dwellers. Now they don't have to fear anymore. So they can go to honey wherever that honey is present. They can go and collect timber. In certain parts of area, timber root is less, they can go slightly longer. So if you remember, in the biosphere reserve, you had this core, buffer, and transition areas. And in transition areas is where habitation is. But forest dwellers can move to the core and buffer area also in search for some of their satisfy their basic requirements, if traditionally they have been living in those areas. So these are two concerns of the Forest Rights Act 2006. The next act is Compensatory Afforestation Fund Act. So what we are doing is we are clubbing all the forest related act at one place, so that finish of forest as an aspect of biodiversity at one go. Now, as the name says, compensatory afforestation. Compensate afforestation, which means doing afforestation as a compensation. That's very clear. Okay. And just now we saw that in the Forest Act 1980, there were some restrictions, but people were using. And in Supreme Court in 2002 judgment, they have come up with this concept of net present value. So let's look at it. Compensatory afforestation means what? Think of it this way. There is a private party. He approaches the state government, says, I need to build, let's say, I need to mine. Yeah, mining is a very good example. I need to mine this area. And it has happened actually in places like Orissa and Chhattisgarh also. So I need to mine. And it so happens that the mining area is a heavily forested area. Yeah, the mine is below, but the forest is above. So the one way forward, striking a balance between economy and environment is you use this area for forest, for mining, but you plant equivalent number of trees in a adjacent contiguous area. That's what the criteria is. You plant this much of trees in adjacent contiguous area. So adjacent contiguous area, they can plant. So for that, they need to pay the state government money. So sometimes what happens is either the private party can themselves do it, or they give the money to the state government and leave the state government to deal it. Usually the private party give the money to the state government because they feel it is much easier if the state government official do afforestation. So they give the money to state governments for what? Two purposes. One is actual afforestation, other is for the net present value. So this they have given. Now, since 1980 onwards, the private parties have done this compensation. Means they give the state government the fund and they get the permission for mining. And this fund rests with the state government, state exchequer, the state public accounts, so to say. Okay. Now, in 2002, the Supreme Court, in one of the cases, the Supreme Court had observed that the money that has been taken from all these private players all through these years, it is lying unutilized. It is what? It is lying unutilized or underutilized. And the value of the money in the year 2002, it was somewhere around 58,000 crores. Such a huge pile of money. In 58,000 crores, you can actually do a flagship program. Just to put things in perspective, Namami Gange is 20,000 crores. Okay, 58,000 is like 3 times Namami Gange. But that is not alone. with interest accruing. As of now, the value of fund is now 95,000 crores as on 2020. So in 2002 itself, when the amount was 58,000 crore, the Supreme Court said clearly the state government is not doing the activity that it was meant to. Therefore, it appointed an ad hoc CAMPA, compensatory afforestation, fund management and planning authority. So it handpicked people for the formation of CAMPA. Now, this ad hoc CAMPA continued for a long time. At this point, I want you to recollect several classes before a Supreme Court appointed body. Do you recollect this? For the Delhi air pollution, environmental protection and control agency. Yeah, this was directly monitored by Supreme Court. At some point, the government wasn't very comfortable. And then what did it get replaced with? Commission on Air Quality Management. Do you recollect this? Yeah, the Supreme Court intervened and it formed a body, and the body was reporting to Supreme Court on a regular basis. So obviously the executive felt that this role is that of an executive, not that of a judiciary. Similarly, here also the Supreme Court appointed an ad hoc CAMPA and said that you need to report to us on what? On the fund dispersal status. There are 58,000 crore, sir, in this year, these states. So this is an all India level. State 1, state 2, state 3, let's say it goes all the way. Let's say 20 states have done this. So 20 states, each state, how much fund they have dispersed and how much forest area has been compensatory afforestation has happened. Because what is concerning is there are two things. One, you have collected the money and you have kept it and you have not utilized it. That is actually, there will be suspicion. What do you do with so much of it? That is one. Second is, it also means compensatory afforestation has not happened. That is why the fund is still pending, no? So on one hand, you want 33% of India's land to be covered under forest. On the other, you are not compensating for the deforestation. So how will you achieve it? So both from, let's say, a good governance perspective, which is having the fund and not spending it and not having the visibility, and from an environmental perspective, because the area under forest has to come down, you are losing on both forms. So that's the overall view of compensatory afforestation. Okay, so Supreme Court appointed this. Over a period of time, the government took upon itself to bring in a legislation called as Compensatory Afforestation Fund Act 2016. So slowly, the control goes from the Supreme Court to the government, but the objective remains the same. The objective, what is the objective? The objective is to ensure that the money collected by the various state governments is spent judiciously and in a transparent manner. Judiciously or expeditiously, whatever you can say, and in a transparent manner. In lieu of what? In lieu of forest land diverted for non-forest purposes. So imagine your table will have three columns. Column A is the state. So what I expect out of this exercise is you have state, you have crore spent, that is rupee spent, and you have forest area. Okay, so state 1, 100 crore has been spent, 20 kilometers of forest has been forested. So that way they want that is the objective, to have a transparent and expeditious utilization of funds that is already present. It is lying there, it is lying idle. Okay, so CAMPA, so the ad hoc CAMPA became CAMPA. So it is no more ad hoc, it is a proper organization, compensatory afforestation management and planning authority. And there are some more facts you can read later also. But basically, this fund is divided in 10 and 90%. So this is something that you need to know. 10 and 90%. And very interestingly, 90% goes to the state and only 10% comes to the center. So predominantly it's a state driven. So to that extent, you may say this helps in federalism to that extent, because 90% of, because forest area both can, because it comes under concurrent list, both of them can legislate, but the actual responsibility of managing the forest is usually done by the state. Okay, so majority of the fund, therefore, it goes to the state. And there are a couple of points I want you to just go through all of it is non-lapsable and interest bearing, and the CAG can audit. So these are all the important aspects about CAMPA. And these are all the typical dimensions that you should see from a prelims perspective. Mains also, this topic is important. They have asked questions on environmental legislations in the past. At least if you know, you can quote this legislation at the right place. You can quote this legislation at the right place. Now, all laws have problems, challenges, constraints, ground level implementation issue. This law is no different. So, what are the challenges? The first challenge is, in some states, have a large proportion of forest, of their land area as forest. For example, Chhattisgarh. Therefore, to get a non-forest land adjacent to a forest to compensate for the deforestation is difficult. Are you able to understand? Suppose this is you're in Chhattisgarh. This is the forest that the private party, they have done deforestation. Okay. Now, if they have done deforestation in this area, as per the law, they need to find some forest land, non-forest land in this area and do afforestation in this area, equivalent to this area. So this is A1. Let's say this is A2. So the afforestation that they should do, A, it should be equal in area. B, it should be a non-forest area. C, it should be a contiguous area. Now, all three situations are not satisfied in all the states because Chhattisgarh, as it is, it has a high proportion of forest area. So that is one challenge, implementation challenge that people have experienced. The second concern is general afforestation programs use this fund. Now, this is a very interesting point where things can get a little confusing. Now, what does this point mean? Suppose a private party did not come, okay, and he did not do deforestation. The state still has a responsibility to increase its forest cover up to 33%. So even if private party did not come, the state needs to increase its forest cover anyways. Do you agree? It needs to increase its forest cover. So it needs to increase its forest cover even if there was no private party coming and causing deforestation of forest. But what some states have been found to do is they increase the forest cover, but they take the money of the compensatory afforestation. So this is called as the fund diversion from one scheme to another, which is not an acceptable principle. Okay, so this was the second problem that we faced. The third, I'll go to this fourth part and then come to the fourth part. The forest bureaucracy has been found to do afforestation in a dense forest. So this is a very polite way of saying that there is fudging of records and therefore potential corruption. So on the record, you are showing afforestation, but when you go into the detail, look at the latitude and longitude, you find that this has been forest for centuries together. So you get caught. And so this is an example of fudging of data, also known as corruption. What is perhaps is the most important problem with the compensatory afforestation is that it is directly in contravention to the Forest Rights Act 2006. So this is a typical problem. Imagine I am a forest dweller. Now only in 2006, what has the government done? The government says, hey, you are the owner. You have the ownership of land. We can't give you title. We can't register this land in your name, but you are the owner of this land. What do I mean? If I am the owner, I have the right for non-timber forest produce. Even if the government comes up with certain projects like schools or dispensaries, they have to go through Gram Sabha. So my consent is taken. So I'm happy. For 10 years, I had no problem from 2006. 2016, this law came, compensatory afforestation. So what does compensatory afforestation says? Now I put myself as a private player. I am the private player. I said I want the forest land and I'm going to pay for it. And compensatory afforestation allows it. Now, which law will supersede which? On one hand, you have a forest dweller which says, boss, you have not taken me into consideration. I should give you consent so that you can take up your project. But the private party says, I need not. Because as per compensatory afforestation, the forest area has been identified and I am going to do some industry or some project, hydropower project or mining or whatever, and then we need to pay for the compensation. So are you able to understand two legislations having a seeming contradiction? Now, which one will succeed? We don't know. We haven't actually come across a case study. At least I have not come across a case study where it has gone all the way up to Supreme Court and Supreme Court has said something but this is a inherent contradiction in the legislation itself. Okay, so why was this in news? I thought I will share it with you. There was this news article which says that the Campa has dispersed 48,000 crores. So this is a big sum of money that has been dispersed for the states to carry out compensating forestation. So this is the broad thing for today. Next class we will discuss the Indian State of Forest Report, and we will also discuss Biodiversity Act 2002. That once that gets completed, then we have few more small topics, and then we look at biodiversity from an international perspective. We will look at IUCN classification, what is sites, wetland conservation, convention on biodiversity, etc. All this should get over in the next class, because not too many things have to be studied for wetland conservation by IUCN. They go very fast. Many of them are very theoretical also. I don't really have to spend too much time. I'll put it under the self-study heading. And there are few current affairs here and there that will also get covered. So most probably in the next class, we should be completing biodiversity only. We should be completing biodiversity only. And in tomorrow's class, we will, that is class number 2 on international relations. We will start with where we left, which was